Bayar, and with me is Rav Uri Allen. We are in the second of this set of programs on the rabbinate and of just discussing and informing what it means to be a rabbi in today's world. Just as by way of introduction, this program is sponsored by JSurge. JSurge is a fairly new organization that is dedicated to bringing Judaism to Jews wherever they are. It is a trans-denominational organization. It does not adhere to any one movement, but to Jews as a whole. We also have a new website besides our JSurge.org, which is JMorim, J-M-O-R-I-M, which is for Jewish educators. And we invite everyone to visit these websites. So when I first entered the rabbinate, and if I may also introduce our resident magician, Joe Strassler, who is in charge of the logistics for this program. So if there are any problems whatsoever, please do not hesitate to blame him. So when I first entered the rabbinate, I was interviewed by a local newspaper, and they asked me what I thought was the most wonderful thing about being a rabbi. And I said, I thought the most wonderful thing was the hours, because you get up in the morning and no matter what you have planned, you have absolutely no idea what's going to happen to you. And so every day was different, and that was something that was very appealing to me. And then the next question was, what do I find the most challenging in the rabbinate? And I replied, the hours, because you get up in the morning and no matter what you have planned, you have absolutely no idea of what's going to happen to you. So like any other profession, those of us who've been through seminary and entered the active rabbinate, what we know is that seminary does not prepare you for being a rabbi any more than any professional school can truly prepare you. Because until you're out in the field, you really don't know what it's like. In the rabbinate, though, some of the unique issues that I found, and I have to emphasize that I found, because that doesn't mean this is not a general statement of the rabbinate, but what I found was we were supposed to know everything. And one of the dangers in the rabbinate is that you buy into that, is that you do believe that you have to know everything, and that leads you into unique situations. In addition to which, every single position, whether it be in a congregation or not, has different perceived needs. And I say that they're perceived needs because rarely do organizations actually know what they really need. They just know what they're looking for. And most of the tension I found in my experience was that there was a difference between what the organization or congregation needed and what they were looking for. So what Rav Uri and I are going to be sharing today are personal experiences and observations. And I'd like to begin with one vignette that actually colored my entire rabbinate in a good way, I think. When I was interviewing for jobs, one of the jobs I interviewed for was in Levittown, Pennsylvania, which is right outside of Philadelphia. And I interviewed, and I did very well in the interview, if I remember correctly. And until I got to one question, which was being asked, and the question being asked by the member of the interview committee was, Rabbi, what are you going to speak about from the bima? What are you going to talk about to the congregation? And I said, I'm going to talk about ethics. I'm going to talk about Judaism. I'm going to talk about history. I'm going to talk about Bible. I'm going to talk about Torah. And he said, well, that's not good enough. I said, what do you mean? He said, I want you to talk about observance. And I said, well, what do you want me to say? He said, I want you to tell my children that they have to keep kosher. So I said, I don't talk about observance from the bima for two reasons. One, it's not something anyone really wants to hear, and I'm really not in the habit of saying things that people don't want to hear. unless I have a point to make. I said, and the other thing is, I've never known anyone who decided to become kosher because the rabbi said on the bima, you have to keep kosher. So he said, well, then I don't want you in this congregation. So I said, let me ask you a question. I said, do you keep kosher? He said, no. I said, so you want me to tell your kids that their parents are doing something wrong? And he hadn't thought about it that way. So I said, I'll tell you what, I'm a new rabbi. My wife is pregnant with our first child, and she's going to have a baby, and your kids are in their early teens. So I'm going to come to your congregation. I am going to have a baby. Your kids are going to babysit for my child. And as they babysit, they're going to get to know me, and they're going to get to like me, and I'm going to make them a special project. And after about 6 months of babysitting for me, they're going to come to you and they're going to say, Dad, we want to keep kosher. And we will not eat in your house unless you do keep kosher. And then they'll keep kosher. I said, what are you going to do then? He said, I'm going to get you fired. So the last question I asked him was, so what exactly are you doing on this committee? What's your function in the congregation? And he said, I'm the chairman of the Religious Affairs Committee. Okay.
Perfect.
That has stayed with me, obviously, until this very day. And I look at the problems and the issues in the American rabbinate as being very much tied up in that very stereotypical story. Uri, I see that you are nodding your head in agreement.
Yeah, that's a great story. Not unique, unfortunately, to you. I'm sure that happens a lot, actually. A friend of mine, colleague Joe Schwartz, says it like this, that the problem in the American rabbinate is that the congregation wants you to validate all of their Jewish choices as good and reasonable and Jewish, and push them to grow in their Jewishness simultaneously. That is the sort of landscape against which rabbis in America are facing. We are the autonomous selves, right? We are all independent, sovereign selves. And and we want our rabbis to validate all of our behavior. Rabbi, I don't do this on Shabbat, but I do this other thing. That's okay, right? How many times has that happened to you where they oh, you're a rabbi? Well, I don't do this stuff, right? There's like a deep sense of guilt about what they do or they don't do. And the fact that your first name is Rabbi gives them permission to like launch in to some kind of confession, which we don't do. But they also, I find that there's a deep interest in people growing in their Jewishness at the same time that we don't kind of wag a finger too hard. And that's an interesting needle to thread. So that story made me think of that idea. I'm interested in this needs. What do congregations need versus what they're looking for? I think that's right. I think they know what they want it to feel like and what they want it to, sort of their experience to be like. But if you asked most people in shul life, well, what should be the direction of the synagogue, of the organization of the synagogue, they can't really put contour to that. I'll tell an interview story also. So I was interviewing at a congregation also in Philadelphia area, and I had prepared this great sermon. It was scholarly. It was packed full of sources, and I was demonstrating how much Torah I knew. And I gave this sermon. I was really proud of it. Then this very nice man came over to me at Kiddush. His name was Herb Udenfriend. I think he's still alive. He's probably 95 or 96 years old. Interesting thing about Herb, you had to have a joke, some kind of funny story for him prepared for every time you would see him. Anytime you would see him, he would say, so what's your funny story for me today? And I can never good at remembering jokes. And this guy had a million jokes. So I started keeping a log of jokes for Kiddush time so I could tell Herb a joke. But he was very kind. And this was amongst the kindest things anybody's ever done to me, I think. And he walks over at Kiddush. He says, we're so happy you're here and to meet you. And but I want to tell you, we know that you know the Torah. That's not the point of your sermon. We know you know the Torah. The point of what we want to hear, what I want to hear up from the Bima, I want to hear something meaningful. I want to hear a message of meaning. Every rabbi knows the Torah. That's not a competition. Like, you don't have to, that's not, and this is not a class, right? From the Bima, we want to hear meaning. And I think about that a lot, not only in sermon writing, but sort of what is the core thing that I think Jews out there are looking from me. And I think having some kind of meaning landscape is one of the most amazing things that we can help provide for people.
So one question is this a discussion of Jewish humor? Yeah, to a certain extent it is, because in the rabbinate, if you don't have a sense of humor, it goes really hard, because we live in a fishbowl. And my experience is that you can deal with living in a fishbowl in one of two ways. You can either be super sensitive to it, which leads to madness, or you can ignore it. And in point of fact, we do a little bit of both. But I'm going to fast forward to try to explain what our days can be like. When I said every day is different. So I took my first job. I went to Greenbelt, Maryland, and home of NASA. And I had been on the job for 2 weeks. And I walked into Shabbat services, and someone I had never seen before, which probably was the entire congregation, came up to me and he said, "Rabbi, can we talk afterwards?" I said, "Sure." I didn't think anything of it until we actually sat down, and his wife had just had a baby prematurely who was in the NICU, and the baby was going to die because the baby had been born without a digestive tract. It was a genetic disease that they had not caught. And he asked if I could help. Now, when I say that we're not prepared for what's going on, for what happens, we are not prepared. So I had never been to a NICU before, and I'd only been to a hospital a few times. So I went to the local hospital, and I went into the NICU. And for those of you who have unfortunately ever been in a NICU, you know that there are as many restrictions as we have right now just walking around. And there was his wife holding a baby. So to make a very long story short, 3 days later, the baby died. And I was with them for the entire time. Sometimes all you can do is just be there. But I remember one conversation I had with a rabbi. They were from Cincinnati. And they asked me if I would help them make funeral arrangements for the baby. They were going back to Cincinnati. So I called their Orthodox rabbi from Cincinnati, and I explained to him what was going on so that he could reach out to them. And I said, "Well, what funeral home should we contact?" And he said, "We don't make funeral arrangements until the baby is dead. That's not Jewish." And I couldn't think of anything other than how could you even say something like that when you are in a situation where death is imminent and you have no control over the situation at all? You try to take control where you can find it. And sometimes it's just, all right, I have to do something. And they needed this to be done. So I said to the rabbi, "Well, you pray for the miracle and I'll prepare if there isn't." The baby eventually died. It was doubly traumatic for me because I had a 3-month-old at home at that time. By the way, I didn't take the job at Levittown, even though they offered it.
But you were going to get fired the following week after your sermon. Why would you have taken that job?
Right, absolutely.
That guy had it out for you.
He really did. He would have, and we'll get to that type of dynamic. But the other thing was that they quit the synagogue almost immediately. And the reason they quit the synagogue, as they told me when I called them, was they just couldn't handle me. Because that's one of the things within the rabbinate is we develop extremely intense relationships with people we've never met before. the word rabbi, when you walk into a house when someone's had a trauma, automatically gives you entrance. But the flip side of that is that you are a constant reminder of what happens when you are in their trauma. Ironically, they rejoined the synagogue after I left because I was the focus of their pain. It was, I don't know if anything like that's ever happened to you, Rabbi.
Yeah, that's interesting. That we are people who pop in and out of people's lives at various different high points and low points, and we don't often get to see the in between parts. So we don't know. I think that's right. We don't know the place that our people hold us in and what associations they're making to any sort of life event. Has that ever happened to me where sort of I'm connected to somebody's trauma? I did the hardest funeral I ever did actually was a woman who woke up one morning, 60-year-old woman, woke up one morning, took a shower, fell and hit her head and was dead 25 hours later. No, healthy woman, nobody expected anything. She just sort of hit her head and didn't make it. And I'm still a pretty young rabbi at this point, and senior rabbi is off for some reason. I don't know where he's at. And so it fell to me, and I walk into this house of just utter tragedy, without the requisite life experience myself of having encountered anything even remotely close to it, thank God. And these people need this stuff from you, right? That's a double-edged sword, I think. Being needed, right? It's sort of, you mentioned that before, Steve. Sort of, we feel we're not the fixers, right? But we do have to do something.
Yes.
Right. That's actually a very big lesson I remember from school, from pastoral counseling classes specifically, that their teachers would say, like, you're not the hero swooping in to solve the problem. You do something else, right? You listen, you direct, you can help ritually, you can frame, you can bring Torah, but you can't bring that person back. You can't solve the illness. You're not the doctor. You're not a therapist. You have other skills, right? So I did this funeral, and the room was packed fuller than high holidays. It was probably the biggest audience that I've had. And somewhere deep inside of me, I found the right things to say in that moment. And you say the right things. And I think what I did was, as I tried to stop being a rabbi when I was writing that eulogy and just tried to be a person. And I just spoke as a person and tried to give honor to this woman's life in a terrible, terrible circumstance. I'm sure they're still experiencing some amount of trauma, and that my hope is that when they think back on the after steps, that their associations with me are more comforting than traumatic. But also, I imagine whenever they think about me, they probably do remember what that terrible day was like, and how hard it was.
But as you said, they will remember you as a positive influence in their lives, and they will never, never forget it.
I hope.
I have a slight confession to make, is that I can't remember people's names.
Uri, but it's Uri. It's written there on the box. If you see it on the box.
Good. I have a hard time remembering people's names. I use many different tricks, but the bottom line is I have a very hard time remembering people's names. And the longer we're in the rabbinate, the more people we meet, and the more times we're in a life cycle event. I'll do a wedding, and 15 years later, I will be remembered as the person who did that wedding, but I won't remember the guests who were there. Sometimes I won't even remember the bride and groom. And I have found myself in ShopRite. You do have ShopRites out there, don't you?
We have ShopRite, yeah, sure do.
Okay, well, I have found myself in ShopRite more than once, running into someone whom I know. And so the general thing is, hi, how are you doing? And then three aisles later, I realized they quit the synagogue because I wouldn't bar mitzvah their kid because they didn't send them to Hebrew school. So it can be a crazy life, but sometimes being a rabbi also is meaningful in many different ways, and especially in ways you don't expect. There was and I know we're in the funeral section of this discussion, but there is in our area, there's a rotation for non-affiliated Jews. When someone, God forbid, dies, the funeral home will call you every now and then. So I get called for this funeral, and it's a World War II veteran, and I'm sitting down with the family and we're talking, and all of a sudden I get this feeling that there's a point of contact here, which I have to admit that since I've been in this community for 30 years, whenever I go somewhere, I usually have a point of contact, and hopefully I'll remember what that point was. I'm sitting down and I'm saying, so your father served in the Philippines in World War II in this air squadron where he was in photo reconnaissance, and he flew in these years. And yes, that's what you're telling me. I said, well, my father was in the Philippines in World War II in photo reconnaissance during these years and flew these missions. And it turned out that they knew each other.
Wow.
They were in the same units. Now, to give you why this is so important is my father never talked about World War II.
Mm-hmm.
So I learned more about my father, and those are the types of things that happen. Those are the types of things that no one would ever believe. But the bottom line is, sometimes you meet someone who fills in a part of your life that you never even thought. I have met friends I had when I was 6 years old and didn't have them when I was 7 because they moved away. It is a constant eye-opening experience to be in the rabbinate.
Totally. Do you find, on the topic of like forgetting and remembering names, do you find that to be an you said it, that I don't do this very well, but do you find that to be an advantage at all? Does that help you at all? In other words, I think
yes.
there is a blessing. I think there is a blessing in forgetting.
One of the things about the high holidays, since you mentioned the high holidays just now, which you didn't.
Could we talk about the high holidays pretty soon? Because I was wanting to mention it.
Right. Is that I prepare for the high holidays all year. So I do reading and studying. And there's this one quote from Abraham Lincoln where it's also attributed to Clara Barton, and where Abraham Lincoln invites this person to a party who has been very nasty to him, has been libeling him. And his wife turns to him and says, "Don't you remember what this person did?" And Abraham Lincoln said, "No, I distinctly remember forgetting it."
That's right.
And it's really very good. It's good to not take things personally. In fact, one of the disconnects in being in the pulpit, I found, was that I never wanted to take things personally because I was never allowed to, but that didn't stop other people from taking things personally. And to know that no matter what I did, 25% of the people would hate it and 25% of the people would love it. Right. So you wanted to bring up the high holidays?
Sure, why not? Yeah.
Before we do
that was an artful segue.
Before we segue into that, does anyone have any questions that they'd like to put into the chat? And
I just want to say, can I just do,
go.
A couple of members of my family are here. My mom, I think my brother and sister are here. It's so nice for you to participate in I know you could probably you could have a whole nother conversation about what it's like to be married or the mother of or the sibling of a rabbi. So it's nice. I hope that you're picking up interesting things. And also my 3rd grade teacher, Linda Glassifer, is here, and it's so nice to see you and be together with people from so deep parts of my life. So it's really nice.
I can tell you, if my 3rd grade teacher were here, he would be scandalized if I went to yeshiva. So what would you say about the high holidays, Rav?
Well, what would I say about the high holidays? Well, I think a general thing, I lived in Israel for many years, and the way that high holidays happen in Israel is a lot different than the way high holidays happen in America. And I think we get the high holidays wrong in America in many ways. Partially we get them wrong just because that's the kind of organizational setup. And high holidays drive synagogue membership in the current kind of existing model of American synagogues. We won't delve into sort of where the people at observance-wise. Why are they only 3-day a year Jews? And I don't say that pejoratively, but descriptively. But I think we get it wrong. In other words, I think we make Rosh Hashanah into a celebratory day and Yom Kippur into a kind of Tisha B'Av, sad, mournful kind of a day. I think that's the reverse, actually. I think in the liturgy, Rosh Hashanah is the scary day and Yom Kippur is the happy day. And somehow that feeling gets reversed, right? I think the sense that we put on in the days, and part of that has to do with Yizkor and all kinds of other things that I think are connected. But I always wondered, what if Yom Kippur was produced by synagogues as mamash, really the happiest day of the year? This is what our tradition teaches. It's one of the happiest days of the year because it's the day where we get to let go of it all. We have nothing. We're not eating. We're not having intimate relationships. We're not, what is there to do? And what do we keep saying over and over and over? We keep talking about God's attribute of love. In other words, why is it the happiest day? Because if we had Yom Kippur on a day, if Yom Kippur was really the day we were all judged, only on the strict measure of judgment, none of us would get out of here alive. We would never make it to the next Yom Kippur. We would all be judged so harshly. But we are so fortunate because we have a God of love. That's Yom Kippur. And so it's a celebratory day that actually our God is the loving God that is forgiving, right? So I always think we get it wrong. But that's on the conceptual side. I find Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur to be really difficult work days, and days on which I don't necessarily get to have the experience I want. It's all output. It's all production for somebody else's holiday. I find it hard to navigate between how do I want to experience the day and the themes, and what do my people need? What kind of will they be disappointed if I don't give the Israel sermon this year? Right? What do they want to hear? So there's this constant back and forth between, I think, what do I think could be engaging, creative, energetic, different, and people's need to have it be pretty similar to last year. They're sitting next to the same people. They're going to have the same conversations in their seats. They want to hear the same melodies and the same tunes. That measure of familiarity is necessary. They're not willing to give up on that. And so I think this balance between trying to inspire but also give people enough of a sense of a familiar is a really tricky dance.
I gave up on the high holidays many years ago. I had
what do you do those 3 days?
I'm happy. I just got love. I had a friend who was also a friend of my father's, who were intergenerational. My father was 30 years older than I was, or 35 years older. And this man, his name was Jerry, was 20 years older than me and 15 years younger than my father. And when we grew up, after I grew up, we became very good friends. And when my father died, he and I became even better friends through the mutual loss. And he was a child therapist in Baltimore. And after my second pulpit, when I was thinking of leaving the rabbinate completely, I called him because I wanted to be a therapist. I found that pastoral work was very important to me. And so he said to me, don't be a therapist, stay as a rabbi. He said, but while we're on the subject, I'm thinking of leaving my profession and becoming a rabbi. And I said, don't do that. Don't do that.
Don't
do that. So we met halfway, and we had this conversation to try to convince each other why not to change. So he said to me, why shouldn't I be a rabbi? And I said, look, I visited you over Shabbos in Baltimore. You go to 3 different shuls. The first one has the good schnapps and the study session before services. The second one has the services you like, and the third one has the kiddush you like. And I've never met a more spiritual person than you. Mm-hmm. And if you become a rabbi, what do you think I do up there on the high holidays? You think I'm actually praying? I'm not praying. I'm worrying about whether the children's services are running on time. I'm worrying about when am I going to give my sermon? I'm worrying about whether the cantor can actually last. All these logistical difficulties that I have to deal with. I said, I gave up on praying a long time ago. I said, if you want to be spiritual, stay where you are. He took the advice.
That's actually been one very fascinating thing about this coronavirus time is I get to check out so much of what's happening in the Jewish world that it was really not available to be able to check out. And you can see, right, I can, my friends in California are saying this actually, that, they're tuning into East Coast time Kabbalat Shabbats in various different places. It's only 4 o'clock over there or whatever. And then they're jumping on or doing whatever they do in Shabbat in real time. That's not being able to do that personal exploration for being trapped on the bima.
Right. So to continue, I then said, why shouldn't I be a therapist? And he said, I see people 8 to 10 hours a day and they're in pain. And if I do my job well and they get better or they learn how to resolve their issues, they leave and I never see them again. He said, you see people in all walks of life and you have positive experiences and negative experiences. He said, I deal with depression all the time because I only deal with the bad things. And I learned an awful lot from that because I then began concentrating much more on what was positive and what was unique. What other profession, in what any other profession, can you go to prison and put that on your resume? I mean, when you think about that, being in the rabbinate has given me unique experiences that I would never have gotten any other way. It's also both positive and negative, but it's part of the perspective of where we are and what we do. So it's, when I was in prison, I remember I was in prison right before Christmas, and I was in prison for Soviet Jewry. So it's a long story. So it's there for Christmas. My family is my 2 daughters and my wife and my parents are there. And we're all in this common room. And I learned an awful lot about the prison system and about the state of the United States, which is something I would never have, I would never have learned. So we're there for Christmas. And of course, the prisoners stage this Christmas pageant for all their little kids who are there. And so there's Santa and his elves and in this big room, and they're giving out candy canes. So of course, my oldest daughter at that time was 5, and she wanders over and wants to sit on Santa's lap, which she does. And he gives her a candy cane. And my wife runs over to save Rachel, and she turns to Santa and says, "We're Jewish and we keep kosher." And Santa pulls his beard down and says, "I'm Jewish and they're UO." And the 2 elves go, "We're Jewish too. We wouldn't serve your daughter anything but." They were New York City councilmen who had been jailed on corruption charges. So very nice people. Where do you get these experiences? There's a question here of, are you ever lonely as a rabbi? The answer is no, I'm not. And that's because the way in which I was trained, and I was trained at the Reconstructionist College, we were taught that we are of the community, but we are not in the community. And that our expectation was that if we ever develop close friendships in the congregation that we serve, at some point, those congregants will have to make a choice between being in the community or being loyal to you as a friend. And that's not a choice you want them to make. So I don't know how you feel, Revelry, but it's very rare that I have friendships within the community because I never wanted to put people in that position. And I found that when I did develop friendships, they were put in that position and no one benefited from that. Uri, what do you think?
I do experience some amount of loneliness. I'm not this is probably for a different discussion. I'm not sure that that's a feature of me being a rabbi or not, but I do feel in this work that that I do find myself a little bit lonely. I think there is a place that people hold us at. And I think what you're describing in terms of the friends makes that tension more tense, because they still want to hold you in that place of that spiritual exemplar rabbi type, and to keep some distance. I think what I've found is even for the congregants, we call them friendigants, right? Even for those people for whom, like, right, we've developed a certain kind of closeness and things, they still won't call me by my first name, right? And for me, I'm like, I don't know, this is a slightly different question, right? When do I get to be just a person with these folks, right? I'm a real person. I have bad days. I have whatever, a regular life going on, just like everybody else. But no, your name's Rabbi, so that means you have to like be much more evolved and differentiated individual than the rest of us. We can kind of we know our deficiencies, but you, Rabbi, even if you know them, you have to like kind of ignore them. And that feels isolating a little bit, to not be able to. The only people I can connect with on my own real personal experience is other rabbis. Nah, that's silly, right? I should be able to have I should be able to have a community of people that are non-rabbinic also, right? That we can just be together as real people. I've found that to be a challenge in this early part of my rabbinate. Yeah.
Speaking about having friends as other rabbis, in my experience, it's rare, because rabbis have a choice, in my experience. And part of that is because I'm an outsider looking in, because I went to the Reconstructionist movement seminary. I didn't go to the conservative or the reform. Rabbis in general who come out of their seminaries tend to be very loyal to each other. And the question is their loyalty to each other more important or of greater priority than their loyalty to their congregations? I was always taught and trained that my congregation is my first priority, not my movement. And most rabbis don't feel that way. And it can be a source of tension. Ori, I should tell you that I always allow everyone to call me by my first name. It's the. So, because Rabbi is my last name. But I would like to at least, as we begin to wind down, I'd like to give two examples of what is something that most people don't realize. And that is, I would say that about 80% of what we do as rabbis is unknown, because it can't be shared, or at least 50% of that 80% cannot be shared. We talked about the high holidays, and we joked about, we joked a little, but honestly, the hardest thing for me on Yom Kippur is at the Kol Nidre, and this is one of the three hardest things in my entire rabbinate, is that the longer I was in a congregation, the more I knew. There's very little that doesn't cross the rabbi's desk. The challenge is you have to know when to respond and when not to. And I would look out on Yom Kippur at the congregation, and I would know who was sleeping with whom. I would know who was abusing their children or their spouse. I knew this stuff. I couldn't prove any of it, but I knew it. And usually I knew it because one of them had said something to me. And I'm looking out on Yom Kippur and I'm watching this, and they know that I know in most cases, or they suspect that I know. And the longer you're in a congregation, the more you know. And that's a very, very hard thing to deal with. I remember we had in my congregation, and fortunately I was in several congregations, so I don't have to tell you which congregation, but we had a felon who had been imprisoned in a federal penitentiary for purveying child pornography. And the question was, would I allow this man to have an aliyah? Because no one knew. Those are the types of issues that we deal with. I had another.
What'd you do? What did you do?
I went to him and I asked him not to take an aliyah, and he refused. He wanted that aliyah, and I let him take the aliyah.
And no one else knew.
Only 2 or 3 other people knew in the entire congregation. His lawyer,
obviously a member of the shul.
The person who arrested him, obviously
a member of the shul. Yes, okay.
and my wife, and she found out from his wife, who said, you gotta let him do it for me.
Wow.
And that was one of the hardest things and I live with it almost every single day. I had another issue where our congregation, and this was in my Greenbelt congregation, this is at a time when there were no LGBT rights, and even in the Reconstructionist movement there weren't. And I was doing outreach to the gay community, and I got a call from my Emeritus, or my previous rabbi, the previous rabbi who was there, who said, Steve, you can't do what you're doing. You can't do any outreach. And I said, why? And he said, because your first vice president is gay, and he's in the closet.
Yeah.
And he leads a double life. And if you do outreach to gay, people who know him are going to come into your congregation, and they're going to out him, and his wife will divorce him. And one of the points that you brought up at the very beginning was, we don't know what's right or wrong. And usually we're put in positions where there is no right or wrong.
Yeah.
So the question is, what do you do? And under that situation, I stopped in my tracks and did not do any outreach to the gay community. And no one mentioned it ever again. I realize now, years later, that probably everyone knew, but it was under the table.
Right. It sort of reminds my dad of blessed memory. I don't know if you spoke about this at his funeral. Somebody else in that week, somebody had mentioned this. He would a young student at Michigan State, when he was the Hillel director, came to him and had a problem, and was outlining the problem. Tell me if I get this story right, Ima. I'm not sure if this is exactly right, but
by the way, your brother was muted.
Yeah, she's muted. There were basically 2 options that this student had with his issue. I could do this or I could do this. And my dad said, well, which one, what do you think? What should I do? And he said, well, I guess I'll choose one or the other. And my dad said, no, you have to pick a third option, right? And that I think is some of the calculus that you're describing about, we don't know, there's no right or wrong, right? And it sometimes seems it's black and white, do it or not do it. But sometimes I think there's usually a third option of what to do. I think if we listen attentively, right? You spoke about pastoral care, right? It was Jonathan Feldstein, according to my mom, right? So the pastoral work is actually the most primary work, which is this is something I've tried to do even in non explicitly pastoral moments. Everything's a pastoral moment. There's not one interaction that I have with Jews out in the world where I don't have to employ pastoral skills, because that's how they're approaching me. So that way is a way to navigate for me, at least a little bit, I don't know what to do, but they'll tell me. They'll sort of tell me enough about what I need to know. I'll have whatever I know. We'll combine it and mix it up, and we'll see,
We have a question of what's the most joyous experience you've had as a rabbi? So I'd like to give you, I can't tell you what the most joyous experience as a rabbi, because truthfully there are too many. But let me give you a wide range. Let me give you something on one part of the range and one on the other. As soon as I saw the question, this is what came. I had been in Millburn for about 5 years, and it was the second day of Sukkot, Yom Tov. And we do services on every day of Yom Tov. And we had some trouble getting a minyan on the second day of Yom Tov, as most people would. And we get to services, and 8 sixth graders from the Millburn Middle School showed up. They had taken off school, and they had come to services. Now, that may not seem like much, but for a public school child in Millburn, and they came in their sweatpants, and they came in whatever it was, and they stayed for Kiddush, and then they went to school late. But to me, that meant that I had created something with the congregation, a dynamic where the kids wanted to come without having to tell them that they should. That's one of the highest points I've ever. And on the other side, there was a person who, when I first came to Millburn, Lincoln had just been assassinated. So, and Johnson was being impeached. So this was in the late 1860s. When I first came to Millburn, there were several people who were very loyal to the Emeritus and who didn't like me and voted against me at every contract, worked against me, everything. And fast forward 20 years, we had become frenemies, which was, and I will tell you that in my experience, having a frenemy for 30 years is actually more meaningful than having a friend for 6 months. So the people who remember you back then, and she was diagnosed with a terminal illness. And I went to see her, and she said to me, when I came into her house, she said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I've come to see you. How can I help?" And we talked for about a half an hour. And after the half hour, she said to me, "You know, I really got it wrong. I thought you were someone else. I didn't realize that you were actually the rabbi. I thought you were a previous rabbi we had who would have enjoyed my illness." And I can tell you that that obviously has stayed with me for 20 years, because the ability to reach a person who did not want to be reached is a joyous experience. I don't know, Rabbi, do you have a...
One personal and one I think was just an amazing life cycle event I was privileged to be a part of. The personal one is at my shul right now in Roslyn. We have as a member the vice chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. She's wonderful, very JTS centric, as the Northeast tends to be rabbinically in the conservative movement. And this shul has never had a rabbi that served the congregation that was not from JTS. I'm the first one. And after a few months of me being here, the vice chancellor came over and said, "You know, you're this young rabbi from California. You went to that school in California, and I really didn't want to like you. But I do. Even besides, despite the fact that you didn't go to JTS." So I thought that was a great praise. That was very personally gratifying. And it's good to know you don't have to go to JTS to for people to like you, people to like your rabbi stuff. But I think so far, and again, I've only been ordained for 7 years. I've been doing rabbinic work a lot longer than that, but not officially a rabbi till 2013. But when I arrived here, it was probably a month after I arrived here in Roslyn. There was a baby that needed a name, and this was a couple that had some real hard time getting pregnant. And the father of the baby had some childhood illnesses that he had survived, and it was really this sort of, nobody expected any of these people to be here in this moment, and they were, and they had this baby, and it was this amazing redemptive moment. And I literally had met them for an hour before doing the intake, just sort of getting their story, and it was just so joyous for everybody, that for the father who didn't think his son wasn't gonna make it, right? And I think there was even a deceased grandparent, somebody in the grandparent generation. For this family, this baby meant everything. And it was bittersweet. We definitely were missing the people who were not there, but it was such a triumph for this family. And I could feel all of their joy and excitement. I didn't really have to do much to create it. They welcomed me into that feeling for them. It was really beautiful.
We have a couple of other questions. Over the course of your career, do you think humanity as a whole has changed? Do you think we can evolve as a group, or do you think people can only change as individuals? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think people have changed. It's all anecdotal. I don't have anything to back that up, other than I think what has changed is the technology and our ability to, and the ways in which we communicate have really brought about a difference in the way culture is communicated. So I know that I communicate differently than my parents' generation. My children communicate differently. But within the Jewish community, the changes in culture, the Gamani movement, the Me Too movement, all of these things have looked for new transparencies. And I think that is a very good thing. I also do not believe that stress and tension are bad. I think that strife is how you do progress. I think we're seeing that now, that sometimes change only happens through cathartic experiences.
There's a word for that. I learned that there's a word for that, actually. Right?
Yeah.
There's distress, which is the negative kind. That's only, right? And then there's eustress, EU stress, which means the positive kind of crucible-like environments that like produce growth.
Right. In seminary, we called it creative tension, which is just another way of saying primal screams, but appropriately.
Right.
And then the question of, the question of rabbis fundraising. I never was in a congregation where they wanted the rabbi to fundraise. And I actually was very happy with that, because remember I said at the very beginning that different congregations have different needs, perceived needs. And when you put the rabbi into one place, then the rabbi can't go in other places. So when the rabbi fundraises, the rabbi can't do other things because he has a relationship with certain people. And I don't know how you feel, but if I gave a lot of money to the shul and the rabbi was the one I was giving it to, I would feel I had an in with the rabbi.
Yeah.
And it is very often that we get people walking into our offices and expecting to get what they want, even when they shouldn't. And that would be unfair. So I really don't have that experience.
I also don't have that experience. I have one kind of meaningful fundraising experience that I had to fundraise for one initiative that I was doing at a shul I was serving. It was called Shabbat Blue Jeans, and it was year one of the initiative. And before we were able to work it into the budget for the next year, I had to fundraise for it for the entire first year of programming. And that was very successful, but that was sort of on a very low level. I think you're quite right. If the rabbi, whatever the rabbi is involved in, they then have not that time to be doing other things. I don't think it's wrong for the rabbi to be involved in fundraising. I think it's actually can be very beneficial. You do run into the who is beholden problem. I think that's a problem in fundraising in general these days. We have this, especially in the Jewish community. The billionaires have their projects, and they get to say everything that happens with their money. And so then we all as a community become beholden to those few individuals. Well, hold on, there was a fundraising thing. Oh, so I'm having this conversation with a congregation currently, and they asked me this. They said, what would you do for fundraising? And I turned around and I said, what do you want the money for? They didn't understand the question. They said, well, isn't the rabbi supposed to, we need money, right? The shul needs money to operate and blah, blah, blah. I said, well, but what do you want it for? Do you have a new initiative? Do you have something that needs fixing? You have to know what you want it for, right? And the best fundraisers are actually the people, right? I think my sense these days is I'm happy to come in and sort of do the final ask as the rabbi if that kind of pushes it over the top. But the real work is meetings and contact points before that happens, to make the case for what you need the money for. Because after all, the job of the shul isn't to raise money. The job of the shul is to give meaning to Jews. Our job, our mission isn't to stay open, just to stay open. Our mission is to serve Jewish people. So what do you want the money for? And if you have an answer, I can help you raise the money, right?
So we have only a couple of minutes left. So I'm going to just give one vignette, which I think sums up everything I felt the rabbinate has done for me, and how much I love being in the rabbinate and love working in the community. And then I'll pass it to you, Uri. So you have a minute or two to be ready.
Oh man, I have to follow you. Jeez.
I've always felt that the most important sermons of the year are obviously on the high holidays, because that's when the most people are there. And as much as you want to infuse spirituality into what you say, you also want to give people impressions, and you want to have, at least I wanted to have the congregation know who I was and know that I was accessible or not accessible, but that I was also human, which is a common theme that we have. And for those of you who do know me, you know that my sense of humor has gotten me into more trouble than I would like to admit at times. So I had been in the congregation in Millburn perhaps for about 5 years. And I wanted to talk about prayer. And I wanted to talk about how prayer, God always listens to prayer, but sometimes the answer is no. And of course, we're always looking for stories. So the best stories I found are from my own personal life. So I explained that I learned about prayer very early because I was a bedwetter. And I would pray every single night not to wet my bed. And that's when I learned that very often the answer is no. Dead silence in the congregation. The older members of the congregation were scandalized. But I had 3 parents come up to me after services and say, "Thank you so much, because my child is a bedwetter. And when you said that, you made them feel like $1 million." And if there's anything that ever encapsulated everything that I believe about the rabbinate, it was that, is that sometimes we take chances, but we always, if we're sincere and if we're honest, we always do hit the mark. Not with the people we necessarily think we do, and sometimes it has completely different consequences. But that was an example of, and of course I couldn't tell anyone until now, but I couldn't tell anyone simply because I didn't want to out any bedwetters. Rabbi.
Yeah. I came to being a rabbi sort of reluctantly, and I am still attached to that feeling sometimes. What I'm finding these days in my experience is I think become more skilled at the things that I'd like to be more skilled in and learn the areas of growth. I think becoming a better rabbi has given me a framework to become a better person, and grow in my personness, in my humanity. All the same stuff that people want from me, I want from myself. And sometimes it's hard to see without that kind of interaction of, oh yeah, that person's struggling and that person is, without the kind of identifying markers that we have through those interactions, through those relationships, where I have to see them very clearly as a real whole person. A lot of that work has helped my inner vision to see myself as not just a provider of space for other people to do it, but I have skills that work on me too and my own family. We didn't even get to the impact of family rabbinate on the family, right? That's a whole nother, that was last week, but we could, but I find exercising my rabbinic muscles, even in non-rabbinic moments, is helping my evolution. I'm just shy of 40, so I got a long way to go, God willing. But I think being a rabbi has helped me be a better person.
Ravi, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's so great to be with everybody this morning.
And thank you all for attending, and we will see you. Remember, I want to thank JSurge and Joe Strassler for doing all of our tech stuff, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful day.